Today I'm going to be painting this lovely tree sparrow in the snow, and this photograph has come from Pixabay. I'll list the equipment and the colours used in the description box below, but here is a summary of what I used this time. I decided to use my watercolour sketchbook for this. It's only fairly small, so it's about A5 in size, so this is going to be a small painting. The colours that I'm using for this are Cobalt Blue, Alizarin Crimson, Burnt Sienna and some new Gamboge. I'm also going to use some white gouache for highlights, and as an alternative I'm using some masking fluid as well to preserve highlights, so we'll have a look at both of those. The brushes that I'm using for this include my size 12 round, my size 6 round and my number 3 rigger. If you're painting this on a larger scale, you might want to use some larger brushes, but these seem to work okay for the scale that I was using. I did use the rigger brush a lot more than I normally do. Usually I only use that for details, but it had a larger part to play in this fairly small painting. So here is the setup. I've got my sketch of the sparrow on the left there, and that's got masking tape all the way around the pages of the book just to hold it down when we add water to that later to stop it buckling. I've tried to include the palette on the right so you can see some of the colour mixing, and I've got 2 pots for water there, one which will be to wash the brushes and the other one is to add some clean water to the painting whenever I want to work wet in wet. And what I'm doing now is I'm just using an eraser to get rid of some of the hard outlines around the edge of the sparrow so that it doesn't show up too much when we add paint over later. I'm beginning by adding some masking fluid snowflakes around the edge of the sparrow. I'm keeping them as simple as possible, just tiny little dots here and there. I'm also going to use that masking fluid along the edge of the mound of snow that the sparrow is sitting on, just in a couple of places, some tiny dots just to preserve a few highlights. And also on the end of the beak, I'm going to put a few dots of masking fluid as well because it looked like the sparrow had snow on the end of the beak in the reference photo. I will add some white gouache snowflakes at the end as well, and then we can try and compare the two and see if one was more effective than the other this time. And like I did in my last tutorial, I thought I'd also mention some of the things that I would change if I were to paint this again. There aren't a huge amount of things I'd do differently this time, but I found that a useful exercise in the last painting. It was useful to me just to note some of the things I'd do differently. Hopefully that's going to help me improve as an artist if I can figure out where I went wrong. Hopefully that will help me to get better in future. But also I hope that it's useful to you as well. If I mention some of the things that didn't quite go to plan, then perhaps your paintings will be more successful than mine because you'll be able to take that into consideration as well. So I'm going to comment on some of the things that I change as I go along, but there weren't a huge amount for this one. I was fairly happy with it. Not all of the paints that I use come from the same palette, so I use new Gamboge from this side. So if you see me reaching over for another colour, it's the new Gamboge that I'll be using, but everything else was from this little palette here. And I thought I'd make a couple more adjustments with the eraser, just getting rid of some of those hard edges. The edge of the bird there is quite light, so I don't want to be able to see a lot of pencil work. I'm just trying to neaten things up so that we're ready for adding the first wash of colour. And I'm doing this while the masking fluid is drying. I want it to be completely dry before I add any paint on top of that, but because these are only tiny dots, it shouldn't take too long to dry. So I'm beginning by mixing up 3 separate colours which are going to form the basis of the background. I'm keeping these really watered down because I don't want them to be too dark. The first colour that I'm mixing is just a really pale blue, and that's going to be used just to add a bit of colour to the mound of snow on the bottom. The other 2 colours I'm going to use will be for the majority of the background, which is kind of like a purpley blue. I'm going to have one colour which is more on the red side, just for some variation, so it's not the same colour all the way down, and another colour which is going to be a little bit darker and more on the blue side. The main colours that I'm using to mix there are Cobalt Blue and some Alizarin Crimson. Every time it gets a little bit too purpley, I'm adding in some new Gamboge just to make it a little bit more grey. And you can see here it's just a case of mixing different amounts of each until I get the colour that I'm happy with. And because this can take quite a while, it's usually a good idea to pre-mix your colours before you get started, and then you don't have to keep stopping to mix up another colour again, because by the time you've done that, sometimes your wash has already started to dry. So I wanted all these colours ready to go. I'm going to begin with the darkest colour at the top and drag that down. I tilted the page while I did the whole sketchbook, so that it encouraged it to run down the page in a nice graded wash. I added in the pink colour every now and then just for something a bit different, so it wasn't the same colour all the way down, and then guided that down until I got to the bird. I decided to work around the bird rather than put masking fluid all the way across it. I felt like the shape was big enough to be able to do that, and you can see that happening here. To begin with, I thought this wash was going pretty well. You'll see when it dries that it's quite granulated and it looks like there's some watermarks in the back, so I think I would probably try and do this a bit differently next time, but I need to work out what it was that went wrong so I'd know how to change that in future. One of my theories was I did rest the book down as I started to work around the sparrow, so perhaps that meant some of the paint ran back up the page instead of being encouraged to run down all the way along. And maybe that had a difference, or that had an effect on the watermarks in the background. So I think next time I might keep it tilted all the way, just maybe rest the sketchbook on something rather than moving it backwards and forwards, just to see if that made a difference. Once I got to the edge of the snow, I was careful around that area as well, just outlining some of the little bits of snow that you can see on the top there. And then I added that pale blue colour into the snow just for some variation, so it wasn't pale white all the way along, and it helped to keep things blended all the way down. Another thing I could have perhaps tried would have been to wet the whole background beforehand and then paint wet in wet. This was all done on dry paper, so I needed to keep the wash moving. It might have been easier just to add some water to begin with, so that's another thing I could try next time. So I left the background to dry completely, and now it's time to move on to the sparrow. I'm pre-mixing some colours here again, so I'm starting out with an orangey colour, which is new Gamboge, burnt sienna, and a touch of blue just to turn that down a little bit. And the next colour is going to be new Gamboge on its own with more water in there to keep it nice and light. And the third colour is going to be a blue colour, so Cobalt Blue. It's mixed in with some of the leftover paint that was in the palette because I didn't clean it properly, but that kind of turned it down a little bit, and they're all very pale washes. This is just going to be to add a little bit of colour to the sparrow and give us somewhere to begin with. I'm going to paint this wet in wet, so I'll add some clean water over the bird to begin with and drop these colours in. And this is just the first wash, so we'll build up on top of this as we go. So once all that water's had a chance to soak in, I can add the colours on top of that. I'm starting out with the paler yellow to begin with and just gradually adding the darker colours on top. I'm going to use the more orangey brown colour for the wings, the head and the tail, and then some of the blue colour will go onto the front of the bird for a little bit of variation in colour there. But this is just an initial wash, so I don't want this to be too dark. I want to be able to build up other layers on top of this. Now that initial wash is down and the paper is still wet, I'm adding more burnt sienna to that top colour so that I can add some darker details along the wings, the head and the tail of the bird and start to put in a tiny little bit of depth. I'm not adding too much detail here because there's going to be a chance to do that afterwards, and I want to keep this fairly loose. I don't want to put in every single bit of detail on this bird. That's always a challenge for me. I do make things overly detailed, but we'll see how this turns out. And now I'm making it darker still with a little bit of Cobalt Blue to put in some darker areas of the bird and put in some shadow details underneath there. Things were starting to dry up a little along the front of the bird here, so I didn't want to do too much work there because it wouldn't blend out like I wanted. It would just form some hard lines. It's all about responding to the paint as it dries and making sure you add things at the right time. If things have got a little bit too dry, just hold off maybe and wait until you can add another layer later. I'm using my brush just to lift out a highlight here to show that there is a defined space between the back of the bird there and where the tail begins. And I can only do this because the paint is wet enough to allow me to do that. If it had dried too much, I wouldn't have been able to lift that area. So I've waited for that initial wash to dry and now I've decided to work on different sections at a time. I'm concentrating on the top of the head of the bird at the moment and I'm mixing up some darker colours to add a little bit of shadow and depth there. I'm starting out with some red and burnt sienna and then I'm going to create a darker tone as well where I'll include a little bit more cobalt blue in there just to darken it up a little bit more. I'm mixing these to begin with, so I've got my colours ready to go and then I'll be able to add some clean water across the face of the bird and then drop in those colours as I go, rather than having to mix them up along the way. I'm working wet in wet here because I want the edges to be fairly soft. I don't want lots of hard edges all the way along, that's why I'm adding water every time. I'm trying not to push the brush down too hard on this because I don't want to lift up the colour I've already added. And you'll notice that I'm going outside the lines. All I want to do here is paint the cap of the bird. But if I stopped right along the lines there, I'd have a really hard edge. So I want there to be a bit more room for the paint to diffuse into. That's why the water goes a little bit outside the lines there. I decided to add a bit of new gamboge to the back of the head because it seemed to be a little bit highlighted there in the picture, and then build on that darker tone along the forehead of the bird. It's around about this point where I switched to the rigger brush to add in those colours. I felt like the number 6 brush was adding a bit too much water every time I placed it down, and the rigger brush was a little bit more controlled. Again, if you did this on a larger scale, you'd probably be fine with the number 6, but the rigger brush was worked pretty well for this part. And I felt like it could just do with being a touch darker, so I've added some more blue in there as well to turn it down a little bit, and I'm going to add an even darker layer on top of that. Every time I add an extra layer on top, I want to make sure that it's a little bit thicker than the previous layer so it sits on top nicely rather than creating some unusual watermarks. While that dries, I'm moving on to the other parts of the bird. So I'm moving on to the wing next, and I'm adding new gamboge to that initial colour that we had in the palette there. I'm trying to tie the colours together so it doesn't look like each section is completely separate from the rest of the bird. And again, I'm going to work wet in wet so we have nice blended edges rather than hard edges. While that's still wet, I'm darkening the mixture slightly with more burnt sienna, new gamboge and a touch of cobalt blue for some darker areas, and I'm applying that with the rigger brush once again. I decided to add some of the darkest areas of the wing at this point, so I'm using primarily cobalt blue and burnt sienna here to create a really dark grey, almost black colour. And I'm going to add that in certain places just to put in a couple of the details on the wing. I'm not drawing it exactly, I'm not copying every single detail, I'm just outlining some of the wing feathers, and then I'm putting in a couple of details higher up. I wanted this to be done wet in wet so it will blend out a little bit. The mixture was thicker so it would sit on top, and I did end up going over with some clean water just to blend it out a little more afterwards. The wash had started to dry up, so it didn't blend out as much as I wanted initially, so I did have to soften a couple of those edges. I mixed up some burnt sienna, a slightly watered down burnt sienna, with just a tiny amount of cobalt blue, so I could add some darker brown details into the wing as well as adding that black mixture that we made beforehand. Some of the lighter feathers on the front of the bird extend slightly over the edge of the wing, so to illustrate this I'm using the darker colour just to paint negative spaces around those feathers and indicate that there's some feathers moving across the wing there. I'm moving on to paint the legs fairly quickly, and I'm using that colour in the centre of the palette there. I was trying to remember what that colour was for and it is escaping me at the moment. So it is just a nice pinky purple colour, so there'll be some Alizarin Crimson and Cobalt Blue in there, probably with a touch of burnt sienna. And I'm making it darker when I want to add some shadow details. I'm using the rigger brush to apply the paint, and this really doesn't need to be detailed. The legs are really small and they're hidden a lot behind the snow. I wanted to make more of the shadow detail underneath the wing, so I'm adding some burnt sienna and cobalt blue to the yellow mix that was already in the palette. I'm making this into a light glaze, so it's fairly watery consistency, and that's going to sit nicely on top of the colour we already have on the bird there. I'm also using my brush to preserve the highlight along the bottom edge there, which was highlighted in the reference photo. I am going to darken the paint mixture for the shadow detail so that that highlight is a little bit more obvious. Next, it's time to add a few more details to the front of the bird. I didn't want to go over the top here, I wanted to keep them really smooth and simple, so I'm using that purple mixture in the centre to add a couple of shadow details underneath the feathers, mainly Cobalt Blue and Alizarin Crimson there, but you can add a touch of other colours as well just to get the right tone. And I'm using clean water once again so I can work wet in wet. I'm going to drop the paint in there so it blends out quite nicely, and I'm not going to do an awful lot with this. Because this painting's on such a small scale, it's really easy to overdo the detail and make things look too cluttered. So I'm just going to put the minimal of marks on this, and I will blend out any edges that get a little bit too hard, so we've got some nice soft details on the front of the bird. I'm creating a darker colour with more Cobalt Blue and Alizarin Crimson. Every time it gets a little too purple, I'm adding a new Gamboge just to turn it back a little bit. And I'm going over some of the areas that I think need to be a little bit darker, so just underneath the collar of the bird and along the front edge there to create some shadow. I'm also going to use that dark colour we made earlier with burnt sienna and Cobalt Blue for some shadow underneath the wing. While I've got that shadow colour to hand, I'm just going to add a touch more Cobalt Blue and use that as a base for the beak. Then once I've got that initial wash on, I will add in some darker black colours with the burnt sienna and Cobalt Blue mix just on top of that and let them mix together while the paint is still wet. I'm using a really light wash of burnt sienna here just to put a bit of colour behind the eye so it's not pure white underneath, but I will build up some darker tones on top of this. For the dark markings on the face, I'm mixing burnt sienna and Cobalt Blue again to create this really thick mixture which is very dark. I'm going to use some clean water for the base of the bird so we can paint this wet in wet, and then we'll add that dark colour using the rigger brush. I'm keeping the right hand side of the face slightly drier so I'll be able to use the rigger brush just to flick out some feather details around the outline. I'm adding clean water to soften some of the edges. I think if I'd have wet the paper underneath enough before, this would have blended out quite nicely, but it is a fine balancing act when you're working on a tiny scale like this. So I'm just blending that out so it has the look that I wanted to go for rather than all of those hard edges. I'm adding some blue to that light wash of burnt sienna we used before, and I'm going to use this for the eye and also for some shadow details around the face. I've been using the dark mix of burnt sienna and Cobalt Blue for some finishing touches around the face, and I'm also using that to draw in the majority of the eye, trying to preserve a little bit of a highlight underneath, but I will use some white gouache to add a touch of sparkle to the eye at the end. This is very nearly done, and I'm just going to add some more details with the snow. I'm removing the masking fluid to begin with, so you should be able to see some of those preserved snowflakes underneath. These are really tiny, so I definitely could have made them bigger if I did this again, so they'd be a bit more noticeable. Alternatively, if the background was a bit darker, perhaps they would have stood out a bit more as well. But the masking fluid did its job, so I'm quite happy with that. You might need to make a few adjustments around the masking fluid areas because sometimes they can leave hard edges, so that's what I'm doing to the beak here. And now for a few sparkly white gouache highlights. I'm adding a highlight in the eye and I'm going over some of the white feathers. I'm only going over a few of these, I don't want to do too much with the white gouache, and then I'm going to use that for some more snowflakes in the background. I used my number 6 brush for the snowflakes. I had a really watered mixture of white gouache and I just tapped the back of it to create some snowflakes over the top. Because the background was quite light, they didn't show up as much as I might have liked. And if this is a bit daunting, you can always practice this on a separate sheet of paper before you do this over the top of your painting, just to make sure you're definitely going to get the kind of snowflakes that you're looking for. Once I'd finished that, I decided to add a couple of larger snowflakes with my brush just to finish it off. So this about brings us to the end of the painting and I'm really happy with it. I think the sparrow's really sweet. I'm really pleased with how this turned out. I said I would go over some of the things I changed and I have mentioned a couple of those as we've gone through this tutorial. Just to summarise here, I think the main one really for me was the background. I'd like to go over that again just to try and get it a little bit smoother. I'm not unhappy with the effects. I think it adds a bit of texture, that granulation in the background, and it makes it more interesting, but it would still be useful to learn how to make a better, smoother background for the times where I do want that to be the effect. So to do that, I think it's just going to be a case of practice, trying with different colours, different brands of paint, trying with the book tilted all the way down at the same angle, maybe working wet in wet. So there's lots of different things I could try to see if they made a difference. The other things that I would change on this are really not that significant. So there's just a couple of areas where I think it could be neatened up a little bit, working on the timing, so adding the paint at the right time so it blended out nicely rather than creating hard edges which needed to be softened later, and just making an effort to help the sparrow fit into the background without looking obvious that it's separate from it. But those are really, really minor things, so I'm not too unhappy with that, and I think that's going to come with practice. So overall, I'm really pleased with this little sparrow. I hope you enjoyed this too. Please let me know what you think in the comments below. I upload a new video every Wednesday, so I will be back again next week. Thank you all for watching and I'll see you again then.